Hello there, and a warm welcome to this, the 244th edition of DF Direct Weekly, our weekly show discussing the latest gaming and technology news. It's official, we've moved up to Condition JeffCon 1. It is the TGAs, we're going to be talking about that this week. Joining me on the panel, it is, first of all, Oliver Mackenzie.
Yes, Rich, here to talk about the Jeffs today. And I have some negative reports about a certain Switch 2 port.
Yes. And Alex Battaglia, hi.
Yeah, hey, everyone. Nice to see you all. I'm also here to talk about the Jeffs. A surprising amount of, I would say there was a lot of surprises here for games that I just really didn't expect. So I'm excited to talk about them.
And maybe we're going to discuss a little bit of FSR Redstone?
A bit.
Okay, fair enough. Yes, well, with that, just want to say, please visit our new website, digitalfoundry.net. Lots of great stuff going on there. And, of course, store.digitalfoundry.net to access our merchandising wares, wearing clothes with our logo on it. It's the future. But with that, let's move on to our first news topic. This video is brought to you by Digital Foundry and CyberPower PC. Click on the link below to access Christmas savings on a number of Corsair Infinity gaming PCs, starting with the Infinity C5, pairing a Ryzen 5 8400F with a Radeon 9060 XT and 32 gigs of RAM. The Infinity C6 ups specs to the Ryzen 7 9800X3D, the fastest CPU for gamers, along with the impressive Radeon RX 9070 XT. The Infinity C7 ramps up the specs still further with the monstrous GeForce RTX 5090 and WD Black SSD. All three offerings ship with a free game. A world-leading PC manufacturer with a 4.7-star Trustpilot rating, CyberPower PC is an official launch partner for PC component brands like Nvidia, AMD and Intel, with over 20 years of custom building experience. A 5-year warranty is offered on all of its desktops, alongside lifetime technical support. Oh, and free UK delivery. But there's more. Enter the CyberPower PC giveaway for a chance to win a Corsair Air 5400 gaming PC, pairing Ryzen 7 9700X with a GeForce RTX 5070 and 32 gigs of DDR5. Get your entries in by December the 19th. Check the video description below for more details. The first news topic, well, as we record this, it's literally hours, just mere hours since the conclusion of the Game Awards 2025. Yes, the Jeffs have been distributed to the games industry, and we've had access to a big bunch of new trailers and world premieres. That's PRM''EAR. Lots of games to talk about here. Oliver, you took point on the selection of stuff that we're going to be discussing here, because I think it's fair to say that, as usual, it was a bit of a mixed bag. I think we should start with Control Resonant. Remedy has given us our first glimpse of an actual sequel to Control.
Yeah, well, it is a sequel to Control in a plot sense. It's a sequel to Control in a setting sense, but it's not a sequel to Control in the sense that it's a third-person shooter. No, yes. Because this is a little different. It looks more like they describe it as an action RPG. It's centered in Manhattan, takes place outside that tower where the first game took place. You play as Jesse's brother in this game, I believe, seeking Jesse instead of the other way around, which is obviously the premise of the first game. This is a cinematic trailer that doesn't say a whole lot in terms of the game's technologies. I believe it's still using Northlight. There are some, I mean, this is a recurring problem with trailers at this showcase, but obviously it's a very cinematic trailer. But then towards the end, you do get some brief snippets of gameplay, which do look a little bit more tantalizing there. But Alex is obviously the Northlight expert, and he's taken a very deep look at some of these Northlight titles, including the recent Alan Wake 2. So I'm curious to hear what he thinks of this trailer and its technology, because I think you did take a little bit of a closer look at this, didn't you, Alex?
Yeah. Basically, well, the first half of the trailer reminds me a lot of if you've played Control, Alan Wake 2 doesn't actually do this too often, but in Control, the intro section seems to be using like their offline rendered version of Northlight. It's using the game's assets and kind of like just pumping up it actually does look like the path trace kind of stuff, like where they pump up everything to like a ridiculous level, and they cap it at 30 and then let the motion blur look incredible. That's kind of like the first half of the trailer, and it does give you a little bit of a sense what I think the game would look like if it if it did target 30 FPS and was, only running like on the highest NPC that existed, but then you get to the last 25 seconds maybe or so. And that's when you actually start seeing the gameplay, like Oliver mentioned. But the second half of the trailer actually shows a lot of the continuity with what we've seen in Northlight to date. And that makes a lot of sense from the assets perspective. I think one thing that Remedy has done really well, probably basically since Control, is that or even Quantum Break, because I think there's aspects of Quantum Break actually in Control in terms of assets there, is that they've made a bunch of really high quality assets and they spread them across games in their Remedy shared universe. And you see that in here. There's a lot of stuff. You see the oldest house right in there. A lot of the Manhattan stuff is probably stuff that's taken from both the Max Payne remakes as well as the sections in Alan Wake 2 that take place in a, essentially what looks like Manhattan at that point in time. And running it through the Northlight engine. And here, based upon the footage, there's one or two shots where I'm not sure of, but it does look like a lot of this footage was actually not captured at console settings, but the image quality is very high. It doesn't look like the FSR 2 stuff that we've seen in the past. But it does look to be PC running without the path tracing on. When you just look at shadows, that's basically the area that gives it away for me. Like shadow maps, there's obvious shadow maps with like Peter Panning bias issues, like when the main character, Jesse's brother, whose name I forget. What's his name? Dylan, thank you. Yeah. That helps so much. Dylan is fighting one of those little monster dudes up close. You can see, you just look at the shadows underneath them. They're pretty obviously shadow maps. But there was one shot where it shows reflections on the ground. Due to the very nice camera angle, it's pretty actually hard to get a sense at what they are. One thing that we did see with the PS5 Pro version of Alan Wake 2 specifically was they did add in reflections, RT reflections on top of all the other Northlight technologies that don't use hardware ray tracing. So that the trailer could be showing off something like that. It's a little bit hard to tell due to the great camera angles here. But in general, I think this looks really good. I'm a little bit sad that it isn't a direct sequel to Control in terms of being a third-person shooter. Because I actually really like the third-person shooter combat in Control quite a bit. It's like playing a Matrix game a little bit. That's how it felt to me. But I'll keep an open mind for this one.
Yeah, I think it looks great. What can I say? I just think a Remedy game just looks original and distinct in a world where many games are not looking original and distinct anymore for reasons, usually specific to Unreal Engine. But this just looks totally separate and very distinct and compelling, right? And I think the fact that there is a gameplay concept that's different to the original, we'll have to see how that plays out when the actual game arrives and we can actually go hands-on and stuff. But the thing that I find a bit sort of irritating about the Game Awards is just how few surprises there are. And when you've got this massive procession of different trailers hitting you, like that's so rapidly, you've either got to produce a concept that looks radically different or a game that looks really, really superb to really stand out. And I think this one hits on both counts. Oliver, any further thoughts?
Not too much. It's just always nice to see Northlight because, like you said, this event was extremely heavy on Unreal Engine 5. Like, of all the remaining games you have to talk about, I mean, I don't even know what percentage, 80% maybe are on UE5. It's quite remarkable. So to see a game based on in-house technology that's using advanced features, that has path tracing potentially in the mix, that has these advanced features in the mix, even if they're not all being shown necessarily in gameplay in this early showing, I think that's really promising, and I like the way that Northlight games look, and I don't mind asset reuse between games, because that's kind of one of the very few tools that developers have to make game production more efficient these days, and I think this looks terrific.
Yeah, I think the other sort of mega success of Control was that it was a game with a strictly limited budget compared to sort of AAA juggernauts, and yet it hit, and it must have been very successful, not just in a game in its own right, but also in sustaining Remedy as a company. And it looks maybe based on all of the sort of negative financial reports we see that Alan Wake 2 might have pushed them a bit too far. So I'm curious to see where this sort of sits in terms of that sort of level of budget, because that I suspect they know it's going to do well because Control did well, but at the same time, Remedy worked so hard just to be sustainable. So, yeah, curious to see how this one is going to land. Let's move on to the next game that caught our eye at the Game Awards. So I've been expecting this one for quite a while. It's Tomb Raider, the next generation game that's coming along. It's called Tomb Raider Catalyst. We got some taster of what that's going to be. But more to the point, we actually saw gameplay, or at least a mixture of cinematics and gameplay of Tomb Raider Legacy of Atlantis, which takes us all the way back to the scenario generated in the original 1996 game and obviously modernizes it. And I think, Oliver, that looked pretty fantastic, didn't it? Catalyst, I think the jury's out really until we've actually got an idea of what the game looks like.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Legacy of Atlantis, it's a Tomb Raider 1 reimagining, basically. But in this case, it's not really like calling it a remake would be doing it a bit of a disservice, because obviously Tomb Raider 1, in terms of its gameplay, in terms of its design, it's a very ancient game. So I don't suspect, I mean, at least judging from this trailer, I don't think they're using elements of that game, but I don't think it should be even a remake in the same way that Final Fantasy VII remake is a remake. It's not anywhere near that level of fidelity to the original, I can't imagine. But they say it has expanded storytelling, traversal and puzzle solving, which you can see a little bit of in this trailer. Now, this trailer, it is a cinematic trailer in some sense, but it's clearly using Unreal Engine 5. It's clearly using, stuff that's probably representative of how the game will actually look. There are bits of gameplay in the mix there, although to Alex's possible chagrin, it's a little bit in the GTA style where they're using cinematic cameras, so it's a little bit harder to tell. But I mean, this looks very realistic. It looks very achievable. It looks fantastic, but it's very much something that you could expect to see on a home console or on a PC in 2026 that looks very realistic, and it's not doing anything too crazy or too cinematic. For Catalyst, it's very much a cinematic trailer. There are hints that it's real time though, like I saw some specular aliasing at one point in a character's glasses. So it's not like pristine, or like probably an offline UE5 render. I suspect it's probably running in real time on something. But is it representative of the final game? It's a lot harder to say. It's very much a cinematic trailer in this case. It's not something that's representative of what looks like in-game gameplay or assets or in-game sequences necessarily. So yeah, I think this showing of these two games is very interesting on the whole. But of the two, I think Legacy of Atlantis is showing us something meaty, whereas Catalyst is really just kind of, the kind of trailer that we're not such big fans of here. Even if it is just the first trailer, I'd like to see something a little bit more substantial.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess you're going to echo that, Alex, and at the same time, should we reopen the debate on gameplay cameras?
I mean, I kind of want to. I mean, yeah, I mean, like when Lara jumps across like a chasm, the camera shows her doing, like she does that really cool thing in the games where she stands on her hands as she jumps and stuff like that. Like the camera does like a full 360 tilt. I'm just imagining myself vomiting while playing a game that does that. But that's so great. I don't think it's the Jeffs. I mean, I don't know. This is like, it's kind of a crapshoot when it comes to actually expecting gameplay. So when we get even the tiniest bits of what is quite obviously gameplay with a different camera, I could complain, but I won't do it as much as I usually do. But I have to agree with Oliver that I think I have a better understanding of what type of a game Legacy of Atlantis is based upon its trailer than I do with Catalyst. Catalyst, to me, it just looked like, other than the character design being different than the reboot, I was about to say Terminator, rebooted Tomb Raider. I think it's still very much in the vein of that, where it's, you got your baddie set up, you got your exotic locale, and then Lara comes in to mess things up. It's like, I just know the setting. I don't know about the gameplay type, etc. If it's more traditional or if it's like Legacy of Atlantis, which appears to be probably, if it is based upon the original game, it's going to be much more focused on platforming than it will be on pure combat, which I think is actually a great thing.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I thought it was really exciting just generally to reintroduce the character and say, hey, new stuff is coming and it's cool. And we're going to start by effectively going back to the beginning and quote unquote reimagining that, and then you get the bigger game, the more exciting new stuff coming the the year after. The extent to which it is new and exciting, we just don't really know. Which leads me on to this supporter question from Pomps. What's up? Exclamation point. Any of you guys getting tired of the CG trailers? I was hoping for some gameplay for the new Larian game. We'll get. I'm not sure if we will get to that later because there's nothing to talk about. But was massively disappointed that we only saw the pre-rendered scene. Just wanted your thoughts on this. Maybe it's just me, but I don't feel super short teasers work as well as they do for other media like movie trailers versus video games. It's hard to get excited when you know nothing besides the dev behind it. I felt very similarly with the Witcher 4 reveal as well. Well, the Witcher 4 reveal actually had some meat to it. It was an actual tech demo running on a PlayStation 5 in real time. So I kind of don't agree with that, but I get the sentiment. And I mean, as I said earlier, with these Game Awards trailers, you're just bombarded with it with sort of random imagery at any point, and a lot of that random imagery is very, very similar to what you saw earlier in the show. So it's really difficult to make things stand out. I also, there were reports this week that Jeff's charging like $1 million to put a 3-minute trailer into the Game Awards. The extent of which that's true, we obviously don't know, but we have seen from the Gamescom rate card that it is expensive to be presented at a Jeff show. So inevitably you end up with shorter trailers and more of them, and I'm just baffled by a lot of the things that I saw. I went to Eurogamer actually, which had a really good roundup of all of the trailers in there because owing to the timing differences, it was difficult for me to actually watch the show. I just watched the trailers, and it's just, I just wasn't really sure of what I was looking at half the time. It's just kind of a bit bizarre. Yeah, Oliver, CG. I mean, I guess we sort of kind of would expect it at the Game Awards, but it is disappointing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think of the games that we saw here, there were definitely some titles that racked my ire up a little bit. I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but Divinity, obviously, Star Wars Fate of the Old Republic. I gotta say Tomb Raider Catalyst as well, which we discussed. There were some games that were pretty egregious just on our list here, and a lot of other games that I decided not to talk about or maybe think too much about because they just showed us a cinematic trailer that tells you absolutely nothing about the way the game looks or plays. In some cases, you have teams that, like we'll talk about later, that formed very recently, debuting massive cinematic trailers that you just know can't be representative of any game product because they probably don't have any game product that would be even years from being able to be shown, right? So it's just, I think this is just so silly, really. I think it's just, the game industry has to get beyond this because when I see a cinematic trailer, honestly, at this point, I kind of groan because it's just like, what does this mean? It could mean nothing. It could mean something. Probably it means about nothing, really, in most cases.
Probably means nothing. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. I mean, Pomps there is talking about, short teasers not working as well as they do for other media like movie trailers. But I've made this point before and I'm going to make it again. Just imagine like the next Marvel movie is coming out and instead of actually showing any footage from the movie whatsoever, they just commission high-end CG production house to produce like anything they fancied based on a treatment. And it would never happen. And yet it's routine in the games business. It's just utterly bizarre. But let's move on. Next game I want to talk about, Total War Warhammer 40,000. Takes something special and surprising to stand out at the Game Awards, Alex, and you were indeed surprised.
Yes, you may be hearing the sound of Warhammers in the distance here. They are working at my roof, everybody. I'm sorry if you hear that. Yes, the reason why this surprised me, and let's hope my voice carries through the Warhammer sounds in the background, is we kind of, so the Total War series has done historical, also some fantastical settings thanks to Warhammer Fantasy. It lends itself very well to that because there's a smaller scope. It takes place on one world, maybe one continent, maybe one country. Bringing that into the Warhammer 40K universe is very hard because it is very large and the factions are extremely different. Like in I would say in normal historical games, human foot soldiers are pretty similar across all these like different dynasties and time periods. But in Warhammer, you've got like 3-meter tall genetic mutant humans versus little tiny runty orcs at some point, like with Gretchen. Like, so how do you balance this? And I thought that was very interesting. And unfortunately, we see this trailer. It's a surprise because I don't think a lot of people in the community who follow these games would actually expect them to be making a game. It was like long rumored, but, it was a question of whether or not they're the right person for the IP, given what they've worked on, as well as the fact that there is right now another Warhammer RTS that is going to be huge in development. Dawn of War 4. Why have two RTSs at the same time? And unfortunately, like I was saying, coming from the trailer, for the first incredible amount of the trailer, you almost get no sense of what the game is going to be, other than the fact that they're announcing a Total War Warhammer 40K game. Missed opportunity, by the way. They're not calling it Total Warhammer 40K. And then you get to the end of the trailer, and they hear, from what has been said, based upon, I think, Medieval 3 is the other game they're working on, Total War Medieval 3, I think, unless I'm mistaken about the title there. They are working on a new engine. They kind of, at one point in time when DX11 came about, they debuted a new engine, and they've been iterating on it since then, but it has become kind of dinosaur-like in some aspects. And here, they are debuting their new engine with this title, as well as the other one they're currently working on. And it already looks a lot better in terms of, I would say, distant detail of enemy units. That's one thing that these games kind of always suffered a bit, is like how much degradation occurs at a distance. I think they look a lot better here. There's a lot more particles and stuff going on than your typical Total War game, which are usually actually kind of lacking in particles for a lot of stuff, because they're not these large sci-fi universe things. And they're also touting here the fact that this is going to be a multi-platform title, which, as a PC user, both I guess it excites me, because I would like to see more people being able to play these games. That's not a problem, but when RTS games sometimes come to console, it is sometimes to the detriment of the PC user interface. If they don't have a switching interface, like what you really need is a interface that changes completely when you pick up one of these guys, and if it doesn't do that, then there's a problem. Thankfully, at the end of the trailer, though, they are only showing replay footage, and you can see that because in the top left corner there's a pause and a play button, which is really wonderful. I like that they kept that. They do show the UI though, and it is actually rather minimalistic, sticking to the edges, transparent elements. But you get to see a lot of stuff like individual unit cards are brought out differently than your typical than your Total War games, very differently actually. And the map is also very different, with like there's unit facing on the map. The colors too imply that Space Marines are together with Imperial Guard, which I think is very interesting. I don't know if they're both player controlled or not. But there's as a Warhammer nerd, this hit a lot of points just for even the little bits we saw at the end. And then they pull out the planet side, and you actually see that hopefully the strategic map is much like we see there, where there's like a planet and you have different like areas that you kind of take over and control and get tithes from and whatnot. But a lot of question marks, but this is, for me, as someone who likes Warhammer 40K and really loves the Total War series, this seems like a really wonderful idea to finally be coming out. I just hope they don't mess it up by doing some bad UX decisions on PC.
Right. Okay. Well, I've just run the numbers, Alex, and I can exclusively reveal that in a 2-minute 49 trailer, you're getting 29 or 30 seconds worth of gameplay.
Yes.
It's the future. I mean, this is apparently how we have to package top-end RTS video games in order to get an audience at the TGAs. This is kind of a bit nuts, right, Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, I do think this trailer looks good, and I'm glad there's at least some gameplay. But I do feel like, in this case, the juxtaposition of that gameplay and that cinematic footage maybe isn't as flattering to the gameplay as much, because obviously you have an RTS that's designed for extreme scale at this God's eye view, and then maybe you have an engine they put some assets into and hired Blur, to work in UE5 or Blender or whatever, right? And then that does not make the gameplay look nearly as flattering here. But I'm mostly interested in this from the perspective of a console player, because it is coming to PS5 and Series X. I have played some RTSs on console. Back in the day, I played The Lord of the Rings, The Battle for Middle-earth 2 on Xbox 360, which was actually quite a good time. Had a very good interface, and I played Halo Wars 1 and 2 as well. Now, those were very controller-adapted games, I would say, especially the Halo Wars games. They had slowed down gameplay. The Halo Wars games in particular had simplified base building, which I think was a necessary concession to get them working properly on a gamepad. So I don't know if that would be the case here. Obviously, I don't think that would be to Alex's liking, but at the same time, I mean, it's very hard to manage large swarms of units, things like this. That gets very complicated on a control pad. So I hope that's not the case here as much. But hopefully it should have reasonable performance too, because those consoles and 2 CPUs, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how they necessarily fare with like really, really gigantic swarms of enemies and foes and things like that. But yeah, I'm excited for the console angle in this game. That's my kind of point of interest.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Okay, well, let's move on. Okay, so I'm looking now at Oliver's next list of titles, highlights and the TGAs. I'm not sure that applies here, though, because I'm not actually seeing too much in the way of gameplay. Bit of a repeat theme there. Where should we begin? Star Wars, Fate of the Old Republic. Now, obviously, there was some, the fact of its existence is great news. Talking about the game director behind it, also great news. Didn't actually see the game, though, as far as I can tell.
No, and this is a case where we have a brand new developer, which makes it all the more galling. They were founded in July of this year. So July of this year, it's December now. That's like 5 months, 4 months. I mean, that's a crazy span of time. Obviously, they've had no time to produce any kind of game assets here and get everything into decent shape. This game is probably not going to get released anytime soon, maybe not even this decade.
Really?
Not even this decade.
I think so. That's a very
2029 would be the earliest date that I could even conceive of in my head for this game, but I'd think much more likely 2030 or 2031. I mean, this is like a really distant reveal. It reminds me of the Blade reveal from I think a couple of years ago, which is also pitched as like brand new studio. Hey, we're hiring. Like that was part of the pitch there. And yeah, this studio, Archanaut Studios, it seems to be a lot of ex-BioWare devs. Obviously, you have Casey Hudson in the mix, but also they're based in Edmonton, which is very suspicious. Edmonton obviously being the home of BioWare. They also have a branch studio in Kelowna, BC, which is of some importance to me because that's actually where I grew up. And it's not a large city or anything. And I wasn't aware of any game developers who were based in Kelowna. Very, very beautiful place, Lake Country, BC, nice, beautiful lake. I've quite enjoyed living there over the years. But enough about me. But that's certainly an area of interest to me. Now, in terms of this more specific details here, there really aren't any. They've said PC and consoles, but not specified what kind of PCs or what kind of consoles. And they've said basically it's not KOTOR 3 necessarily, and it's the Old Republic 3. But it's in that kind of lineage of those games. I'd be curious to see how many gameplay elements they bring over, if they would maybe adopt kind of a Final Fantasy VII Remake style combat system with a bit of pausing, or what they would do with that, if they would do any kind of like a semblance of a turn-based system at all, any kind of like real-time combat that's based explicitly on timers. I'm not sure, probably not likely. Beyond that, I mean, what do you say? It's clearly a trailer that's not representative of anything beyond like moods and themes. It's clearly an offline render. It's like from the moment you see like those raindrops and all this stuff, it's like clearly not running in real time too much anything. So I mean, it's kind of a waste of an introduction because the game has been introduced, but all I really feel like I have is the title and the studio.
Yeah, I got so much of that. It hits me so hard. I'm reminded of that, that George Lucas quote, like, "Oh, they're already building the sets. I got to get writing on this script." Like it's that exact same feeling. You're like, I don't even think they have an idea of what's going on here, for how far along it is. But we do know some. Okay, confirmed lightsabers. Confirmed. Star Wars, we don't have that much going on here. I guess I'm a little happy that this means that Lucasfilm is content with the old extended universe existence.
Oh, that's true.
I was just thinking about that now. I mean, some of the EU has some really bad crap in it, I would say, but the Old Republic was at least interesting. Being so, far away in time, although this universe has had no apparently technological development in all this time, which always interests me. But yeah, there's almost the only thing I can really say here is that it's a CG trailer, and it means a game might come out at one point in time.
Yeah, that's a very astute observation there, Alex. Thank you. I just think, going back to the sort of movie theme, if this was an announcement in the movie space, they wouldn't be just coming up with computer-generated footage of what they think the movie might look like. They would possibly, crazy thought, they might have actually had the creative on stage, maybe with some concept art in the background, talking about the game and getting excitement that way. But apparently that's not good enough. Not great. Oliver, next game you want to talk about here. Should we talk about Exodus?
Yeah, let's talk about Exodus. Exodus is kind of a mixed reveal. I would say mixed in the sense that it is largely cinematic. There's maybe one or two small hints of gameplay in this trailer, but the key difference for me is that this is actually appears to be in-engine, appears to be real-time, has some frame rate drops, is clearly UE5, and they've also confirmed UE5 separately, although anyone with eyes could see that it's UE5. It's very easily guessable at this point, because we've seen so many titles with UE5, and anyways, throw a stone and you're bound to hit a developer working on a UE5 game at this point. I mean, it's ridiculous. But anyways, this is another ex-BioWare game. They talk about, ex-BioWare staff, things like this being on the team. Looks great. It's very Mass Effect. The premise is similar to those Mass Effect games. You have aliens, alien humanoids, you have humans. It's a cover shooter, they say, with special abilities, although they've thrown in some stealth mechanics and things like that in the mix. So it seems very familiar, I think, for people who are into Mass Effect, but I quite like the Mass Effect games, at least the pre-Andromeda Mass Effect games back in the day. And I'm kind of into this. They say early 2027. It looks very realistic, looks very achievable, but also looks really good. So I'm not too down in this trailer, even though it is mostly non-gameplay footage.
Okay. Yeah. Alex?
Yeah. So here, there's a couple things that I do really like. Is like, I do think this is all showing stuff that will be in the game and is actually rendering in real time, primarily on something. There's like one shot where I think it might have been from like a cinematic that they did render offline, just because of one aspect of it. I'm like, I don't know about the way that looks, but the rest of it though looks very realistic to me. I do like Mass Effect 1. I hope this leans more into that. There's one aspect of the trailer that did scare me that it won't, is that there's like some sort of Destiny storyline, like, you child of the netherworld, you must take up your destiny. Yeah. And I'm like, oh no, another messianic story. I'm like, so I get a little bit worried about that, because it's very tropey, and I thought that's something that the first Mass Effect didn't have a lot of, unlike the sequels. And I'm a little bit worried about that. One thing that I want to talk about is the use of metahuman, very obviously. So metahuman produces great results for background characters, I would say, in most games. People you don't really walk up to and spend a whole lot of time with, but I would say the limits in the shading that are on them are slightly visible here, even on like the main character, and or even the side characters. And they're obviously not going for 100% realistic character proportions in their face, and that's perfectly appropriate. It's fine. I don't want to. They do have a little bit of that kind of shovelware look of their facial proportions, only in their facial proportions. There's a way to do facial proportions, and they chose the one that is very common. That's fine. That's their choice. But the eyes specifically, they are very white, as in they're like lacking kind of like transmission, as well as the eyelids themselves should be shadow casting onto the eyeball. And in a lot of scenes, the eyes, to me, look a little too pristine white. And it's giving everyone a kind of glowy-eyed look. That may be their design, but I also think that is something you see pretty commonly in metahuman characters in games. And you just kind of see it all over the trailer. And I think that's one of the things that's getting a lot of people, beyond the proportions being that negative word I said earlier, like they're using that very specific proportions of the face, but the eyes are kind of distracting. I think the rest, though, visually is utterly fantastic. So I'm actually very happy with the rest of the visual package here.
Okay, good stuff. We're going to round out this mini section by talking about Divinity, which was a big reveal by Larian. Obviously, massive excitement there. Unfortunately, once again, we didn't actually get to see anything about the game. People on wires, though, if you're into that, plenty to get you excited. Oliver, why did this make the list?
This is one of the more egregious ones, if only because, I know the pedigree of Larry. And I don't think the final game is going to look anything like this. I gotta say, like, this is just very aspirational, very offline CG. It does not look like anything that could ship in a game. Definitely does not look like anything that I suspect Larian will ship in a game. It's described explicitly as a cinematic reveal. It's basically a Divinity Original Sin 3, but kind of soft rebooted in that kind of way that developers do, I think, when they want to achieve larger audiences. Obviously, that's evident in the name, and I think it's also going to break certain plot connections with prior games, or at least direct plot connections. I'm sure there'll be references and characters and things like that, but not a direct continuation. But this is... no platforms have been announced for this game whatsoever. Not at all. Not PC, not console, not anything. No engine has been announced for this game, and no release date has been announced for this game. So it's a total non-announcement. As far as these announcements go, it announces the least that you can announce, basically. So that gets a bit of a ding for me, as with Star Wars. This is another CG special.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, let's move on to some games where we can actually pass some comment. Oliver, you wanted to talk about Ontos from Fictional.
I did. So this is interesting. It's actually using a proprietary game engine called HPL4, which is cool. They described that in an interview. I don't know any particular details about HPL4, but it seems very interesting. They're choosing to go with a proprietary game engine, especially when you'd think a game of this size and scope potentially would be really well suited for Unreal potentially. It's interesting to see them going in a different direction. They describe it as an exploration game, a scavenging game. It has those elements. It's a tension-packed game, but they say it's not as horror-focused, it seems, as some of their prior titles, which include Amnesia, the Amnesia series, and Soma, which was quite good as well. So I'm definitely into this. New technology, looks interesting. It's got Stellan Skarsgård in there voicing some kind of important character in the game, maybe some kind of antagonist. So I'm pretty into it at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely looks different to a lot of the other Unreal Engine stuff we saw. Also, stylized characters, which
better stylized though.
Yeah,
better than the last trailer of Exodus that we talked about. I did get a big chuckle at the beginning with like all the rats acting as like a computer voice modulator for someone or something like that, and they're like, "I can explain" or something like the voiceover. It's like that's so ridiculous.
And moving on swiftly, let's talk about Star Wars Galactic Racer. This looked quite interesting, didn't it? Pod racing is back, but this time set in the sequel trilogy era, based on the setting.
Yeah, well, I would clarify this is not pod racers actually, but this is speeders. This is speeders, not pod racers. But yeah, obviously there's that classic Star Wars pod racing game. But I'm into this because it looks like a reasonably big budget racing game, which we see very few of. I'm sure it will have arcadey handling characteristics. There are a couple of details in here that I'm not necessarily as big of a fan of, like there's an emphasis on vehicle customization and builds and branching routes. But they do talk about vehicle contact being a key emphasis. So it could be like a burnout racers. Yeah, road rash. Yeah. So I'm into this.
Mm-hmm. Alex?
I do see it's an Unreal title. It's actually mixed in the last card, but they also have GeForce RTX and Intel already down there, which is very interesting. Usually you don't see hardware sponsors in the first initial announcement trailer, unless it is from like one of the like GTC shows or like some sort of like CES show where they want to show off some hardware for the first time. So that's interesting, and that I hope that bodes well for the game on PC. Who knows though? I do like the fact that it is, that lived-in hardware design that you see in a lot of these games. I am also less keen on the customization aspects, but I am keen on an arcade-style racer. Mm-hmm. So those are all things that sound really great to me. The production value was ridiculous in this trailer. It did look incredible, but how much of that will carry over to the final game is hard to know. But it did look much more, based on a lot of the aliasing in the shots, it did look like it was actually something from that was running on something. There's no reason. Right. There's no reason to include aliasing in something unless you really want to. It's something that was running. So that's positive for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Cinematic cameras, though, Alex.
Yeah, I know. I mean,
I'm just winding you up.
I know. There are some aspects. I mean, a replay camera could do some of these things. That's really, I really do wish they did show some gameplay. It would probably look just as incredible. Just, they could have shown that, but they didn't. Whatever.
Yeah. It's just a lot of the things you say, Alex. I'm just thinking about the audience reaction. I could just imagine somebody saying, "What's Alex got against messiahs?"
Yeah, what is this anti-messiah complex that Alex says?
Yes. Should we move on to No Law? Sorry, Oliver.
No Law. Well, this is a game I'm interested in part because of the reveal trailer, which looks very cool, very cyberpunk. It's a first-person shooter. They're showing off some significant, although very quickly cut segments of gameplay, which I do appreciate. And it is first-person gameplay that's not using a cinematic camera, so Alex should be reasonably happy with that development. But the other reason why I'm interested in this game is that it's being developed by the developer Neon Giant, who produced The Ascent, which I thought was a sublime little shooter. This obviously takes place in a different perspective. It looks great. There are, I don't need to say this again, but it's Unreal Engine 5. That's obvious from the very first frame of this trailer. I've not even looked up if they've commented on it because I don't need to.
Obviously, the developers of The Ascent, in terms of how they worked with Unreal Engine 4, it's pretty legendary stuff, Alex, when we go into the weeds there. But this does look pretty, really good, right?
Yeah, it looks really good. Their attention to asset detail will probably put them right up there. They're very good with that stuff. I think that's one of the key things that I really loved about their last game. I saw this game technically 2 years ago now at Gamescom before it had a name. Back then it was described as more, Deus Ex-like. So it is a first-person shooter, but they also show, oh, look, he's attacking them from above and they don't know that he's there, So that is, I think stealth will actually be a huge part of it. As from what I understand, it is going to be more larger, have you played Deus Ex? It's like a small hub world area. That's what it's going to be. Key takeaways from the trailer: UE5, most definitely. I already knew that, but they are using hardware lumen here. You can see that based upon some of the camera angle stuff, SSR just wouldn't show some stuff that it does show in the reflections very nicely. So all that stuff looks great. I'm very curious to see. The performance was very iffy throughout the whole trailer, but from what I understand, the game has a whole ton of AI in it that is persistent. So getting games like that with actually, larger AI routines in an area that you can freely explore all the time, that is probably going to be a CPU killer. So 30 FPS, 60 FPS on current gen consoles. 60 FPS would be incredible based upon what I'd seen right here. So we'll have to just see how the final product looks.
Lighting, Alex, sublime.
Yeah, very, very well done here. I think I think overcast days are one thing UE does really well. But also they do show off at different times of day here. That I remember when Cyberpunk was first revealed, they're like, they showed Night City off in daytime. How dare they? It's called Night City. I'm fine with that. I think it's really great to see a day-night cycle, and especially if it's actually incorporated into the immersive sim-like gameplay here, where there's different stuff happening at different times of day. So
yeah, it's quite funny that this sort of overcast daytime setting is basically the basis for a whole bunch of these ultra realistic mods that come out for the likes of Cyberpunk.
Yeah, it is true. It's one of the easier things you can do. Getting sunlight to look right on a lot of materials is actually very hard. So
that was another thing which sort of, if you go back to the Ride 4 game that had this sort of 15 minutes of fame.
Yeah.
Exactly the same reason. Yeah, maybe you should do sort of like a supercut of realistic, quote unquote realistic games and mods at some point, because you'll see it straight away how it works. It's quite interesting. Oliver, let's talk Pragmata, which we saw at Gamescom. We saw much more of it here, and we got a Switch 2 announced, which is pretty cool, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on a couple of games here at the end, but Pragmata I thought was worth mentioning. This wasn't actually part of the main show, I don't think. I think it was part of the pre-show, but they showed off a new trailer for the game. They have a new gameplay demo that is out now on PC. They announced a date, which is April 24th, 2026, and the Switch 2 release, which is very cool. So I think it's nice that Capcom is continuing to support Switch 2. I'll be curious to see what, if any, ray tracing features make the grade there, if some version of their RTGI would presumably make the cut, if some kind of RT reflection solution make the cut, perhaps not. But I'm very into Capcom and their support of Switch 2. I think it's very cool.
Yeah, I was talking to you earlier, Alex. Sorry, I was talking to you earlier, Alex, about the fact that the downloadable demo is the Gamescom demo, and you just said, "Oh, I didn't get to play it at Gamescom." But basically, the gameplay demo is in a very enclosed sort of environment, and what we're actually seeing in the trailer here is much more sort of wide ranging than that. So yeah, it's pretty cool, I think.
Yeah, looking at the website. By the website, I mean Nintendo.com. They have a announcement of the game, and you can look at the product page for it. And they do have screenshots.
Okay.
And that they are interesting. They appear to be 1080p screenshots, but they have a lot of the hallmarks that we saw from the Switch 2 Resident Evil Requiem trailer, if you recall that. And here it actually, I don't want to call it, but it does look like DLSS-like, the image, which is very interesting that you can already kind of see that. It looks like a DLSS upscale of 1080p. And you can see it specifically in the hair here that they are using the hair cards that the engine apparently, I do wonder how they do it, because if you art up a game to use hair cards versus strand hair, it's laborious to really make sure that it looks fine and normal enough in most scenes of the game, and also you're making two separate assets that are going to be lit and shaded and move differently from one another. So it is very interesting, but that is what it appears to be. But based upon what we saw with Street Fighter, I think this will probably run pretty darn well at a nice 30 FPS is what I'd presume of it. But like Oliver, I am curious to see when and if we'll ever see other games other than Star Wars Outlaws running with ray tracing on the Switch, because that has yet to be seen.
Okay. A couple of final games I want to talk about. AUDIOMECH, Oliver.
This is from the developers of AudioSurf, and it's a similar kind of core concept here, but instead of being this kind of beat matching rhythm game, it is a twin stick shooter, which I think is cool. So basically you supply your own music through your own library. Not sure how that would integrate, if at all, with the rise in streaming services, because obviously people don't frequently have DRM-free downloads of music anymore on their computers. They have a Spotify account. But in any case, I think this is pretty cool. I'm always into these games that integrate your music in some kind of sense into the game. Recently, I've really enjoyed that with GTA 5 and loading up my custom soundtrack into the game. They call it self-radio and getting that music playback in game. I think it's really cool. So this is just something that I'm into. I don't know if anyone else is really into this, but I could see myself playing this with my music library.
Well, the recent release of Sectori has reminded me that twin stick shooters are actually really, really cool and fun to play.
Yeah,
looks cool.
Sure.
Alex?
I agree. I mean, I don't play a lot of audio-based games for a while now, but if there was one I would probably want to try out, it'd be one where I load up my own music into it. So this would be it.
Okay. Just trying to imagine what your music would be and the impact on gameplay. Final game we quickly want to discuss was TankRat, which I thought looked really, really cool.
Yeah. Rich, you pointed this out, and it missed my attention in the initial roundup of games here. But it looks like a pretty fast action game, open world action game. Does not look like anything too crazy in terms of its graphics, but it looks fun, and I kind of miss just like having a fun action game, and it seems like something that's a little bit absent from the Game Awards with its emphasis on cinematic experiences, story experiences, big AAA games. Just give me something fun, enjoyable, and breezy like this. I think it's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's my exact opinion. I mean, those games do come out all the time on Steam, which is why I'm happy that they do exist. But I want to see them be a bigger part of the discussion in things like this, because they make up a huge bulk of the industry. And it seems like with all these large AAA games being announced before they've even started development, that I'd like to see something that actually showed off gameplay. So bravo.
Bravo, absolutely, yeah. I think that's kind of everything we got to say about the Game Awards for this year. I didn't actually catch the awards themselves. That's one of the weird things about covering it on DF Direct, is that the kind of ceremony finishes up and then it's scant hours later when we actually wake up and then record the show. So, yeah, haven't got too much to say about that. You did catch a bit of the ceremony, the first hour, right, Oliver?
Yes, I knew I had to be up for this recording, so I watched the first hour of it before I decided that's enough, and I went to sleep, which perhaps does not speak too much to the stimulating aspects of Jeff's performance there. But I thought what I saw was reasonable. I tend to tune out the awards a little bit and just focus on the announcements, because that's really what I'm there for. And I think we saw a reasonable mix of new games, some surprises, maybe not enough surprises. The area where I'd really ding them is, I think the quality of the trailers was not high enough. I think the quality of the games is probably high enough. The quantity of the games certainly was more than high enough, but just the quality of that trailer presentation wasn't high enough. And I noted also that Microsoft announced, I think in the early portion of the Game Awards stream, there was some announcement. I don't know if it occurred in the Game Awards stream or alongside it in some form, but they're doing a developer direct next year, which I think is the correct format for showcasing a variety of games. And they also confirmed, perhaps to no one's surprise, that Playground Games will be a part of that presentation. So that's what I'm really looking forward to in the new year.
Cool. Okay. Well, with that, let's move on to our next news topic. I like news stories that come out of nowhere, and this one was actually delivered to us directly from the developer. It's a new outfit called Redo Apps, and they've basically created the Redo engine, which is essentially a suite of PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, and PlayStation 3 emulators. And they've released a game this week, Cloudberry Kingdom. It's essentially a port of a game that came out in 2013. It's quite a simplistic indie-style platform game. What sets it apart, though, is that if you buy the game on PlayStation 5, you actually get 3 different downloads. You get the native PS4 app, you get the native PS5 app, and you get a PS5 app that is running the PS3 version under emulation. And this is basically the first emulated PlayStation 3 game that you can get on the PlayStation 5. And it was great to speak to the developers to get an idea of actually what they're doing here, because obviously our entire sort of knowledge of PlayStation 3 emulation at this point is RPC S3, right? But it turns out that this emulator is actually very, very different in concept and execution to what RPC S3 is actually doing. You can sort of imagine that RPCS3 is essentially trying to emulate all of the distinct components of the PlayStation 3 and then get games running, etc., etc. What this one is doing, it's an HLE and a high-level emulator, which is, instead of emulating components, it's emulating outcomes. So it's basically trying to deliver the behavior. You know, you give it the code and it basically tries to give you the a sort of emulated experience based on the outcomes of what the original hardware would have done. If you go back all the way into the 90s with like Alt for HLE. You remember that, Alex?
Oh, yeah. I covered it in a video. I can't remember what it was. It was maybe about Mario Kart, Spaghetti Kart on PC. But yeah, the concept of, because you don't have the power to do that yet. That's why it kind of came about in the 90s. And here I imagine it's they even directly reference it in the piece. You know, there isn't the power there. And not necessarily like, it would be a massive endeavor for a team of their size to build a generalizable emulator for the purpose of commercial products, right? You have to limit your scope. And here the idea is to just get the outcomes looking right for the titles that they want to cover. There's no reason for them to be covering those SPU heavy titles necessarily, although we don't know what they're cooking up, obviously. So, but yeah, here I'm excited to see it. But it interestingly does kind of conform to what we've always said in the past when we've had this question brought to us by supporter Q&A, where people are like, so when will we see Metal Gear Solid 4 on the PS5? Yes. Or when will we see Killzone, the Killzone collection? All things that I really think should happen regardless. But we always kind of said, like, you know, from what we know with RPCS3 on PC, all the games that don't really heavily use SPUs can actually run fine on like Zen 2 processors. That's why you can get games like Demon Souls running fine on a Steam Deck, right? Versus, if you try load up Killzone 2, if you try to load up Uncharted, or even MotorStorm, you'll have issues, the game running well and running at proper speed and not being filled with tons of graphical glitches, among other things. So this is kind of what they did, where they describe in the piece basically that, the game is actually using SPUs lightly, for some things, not as heavily as nearly as like the AAA games would be doing. For example, AAA games would sometimes do all triangle setup from the GPU on the SPUs, something that GPUs had taken over since hardware TNL. And no, they're not doing that. They're actually not doing any of the SPU stuff at all here, rather using native hardware functions from the PS5 to get the same results and pump them back into the gameplay. So it makes sense that they couldn't do it, but I'm curious to see what other titles they could bring over based on this. Like, based upon this, it does seem like something like Demon Souls would be possible, or even some other early PS3 efforts.
Yeah, there's a lot we don't know here, specifically. I mean, obviously a 2D platform game isn't going to be like using a huge amount of GPU functions related to 3D rendering and stuff. So, it's very much a case of we have to wait and see what happens with this emulator. The stuff that sort of springs to mind for me, I mean, the one that easily stands out is Ridge Racer 7, which 1080p 60 on PS3, just clever use of the technology to make a game that looked great, but actually it runs really, really well on RPCS3, which says to me that it's barely touching the SPUs. Yep. Interesting that, we're talking about the SPUs here. They actually turned off the SPU emulation completely here and just plumbed in audio and video decode features from the PlayStation 5 to do the job, which is all that the SPUs were used for. So, it's basically not a sort of holistic emulator in the same way that RPCS3 is, but basically, I guess almost like a framework. And they've basically said they developed it based around 10 games to make sure they just weren't developing a Cloudberry Kingdom PS emulator, which I thought was fun. A couple of things that I noticed which were fun. When you first boot the game, you get a screen which explains how the DualShock 3 controls map over to the DualSense, which is kind of essential, really. And it supports save states, just like the Sony emulators for PS1 and PS2 do. So you can basically just dump off the memory at any point and then just return there, which I thought was pretty cool as well. So, I guess, when we put the headline for the news story was basically we've played the first PS3 emulated game for PS5. But, I guess it's a game that we probably, on the one hand, it's entirely predictable that it would be a fairly simplistic game. But on the other hand, first PS3 emulated game for PS5, you're kind of thinking about all of those games, those classic AAA titles that are restricted to the PlayStation 3 and see no real chance of ever being ported or remastered. MotorStorm. I guess Metal Gear 4 will probably get at some point.
I hope.
Just a fascinating exercise, really, and it was really cool for the developer to reach out and say, "Hey, look at this. It's see what you think about it." And that led to further conversations, and then to the news piece, and indeed this direct segment. Oliver, thoughts?
I looked up this game in particular, Cloudberry Kingdom, and it seems to be very light in terms of emulation challenges. Obviously, you've discussed that in your piece, and the developers seem to admit that pretty freely. But RPCS3 has listed Cloudberry Kingdom as playable since May of 2017.
That's a long time ago.
Which is extremely early for RPCS3. Indeed, I think they reported getting the game to boot into like the main menu, obviously, I'm sure, with graphical glitches and issues like this, back in January of 2016. So this is like one of the very first games they had running in any form on RPCS3. This is a game that doesn't present a lot of emulation complexities. When you look at the cell with its precise SPU behaviors and timing and different math operations that maybe don't match x86, and obviously the use of SPUs for graphics rendering and the stuff that developers like Naughty Dog were pulling off on the platform, this is like posing absolutely none of those problems and really doesn't answer any questions about the difficulties of emulating those games or the capability to emulate those games potentially in the future on the system. So yeah, I'm not really sure this tells us much. I'd love to see MotorStorm in the system. I'd love to see games like Metal Gear Solid 4 in the system. I imagine Konami is probably trying to work something out with Metal Gear Solid 4 to get it running on modern platforms, because obviously they have their second collection of their Metal Gear anthology to deliver, which they've promised but not specified any particular titles for. So I hope there is some kind of solution. I suspect Sony, if there is a robust solution, though, it really probably should come from Sony, and I imagine it will come from Sony as opposed to a third-party developer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of games on the PlayStation 3 that could get releases for PlayStation 5 through basic emulation, right? I guess once again, Ridge Racer 7, it's just a game that's kind of like marooned on PlayStation 3. You can't play it anywhere else. And if it is a fairly simple game to emulate on PS5, then let's see it, right? Because otherwise, I can't see Namco doing a port as such. So emulation would be a good route forward. Certainly a really interesting story. I'll be curious to see if anything comes from it. At least when we've got our news story out there, the games industry are now aware that this emulator exists, and the emulator was designed for commercial purposes. So, if further projects do emerge, I guess we'll see them in due course. But let's move on. Right, let's talk about our next news topic, which is a surprise quote-unquote drop for Skyrim, the anniversary edition on Nintendo Switch 2. Came out of nowhere. And we're going to be doing a full video on it with various comparisons and whatnot. But I think it's fair to say that it launched in a bit of a state with some issues. And Oliver, you had a number of people approaching you about things they discovered in Skyrim on Switch 2. Do you want to go into that a bit?
I do. First of all, the biggest issue with this port, in my opinion, and what truly makes it unplayable in my view, or very difficult to play, very difficult to enjoy certainly, is that input lag is awful. If you look at these tests, I captured this footage at 180 FPS on my S5 camera, and I'm jamming my finger right into the thumbsticks, and you can see how long it takes the game to respond. Right. It just feels truly awful. It feels terrible to play. I would say it feels similarly laggy docked, if not even laggier. And it doesn't change meaningfully when I use the Joy-Cons with a physical connection. By the way, this is not a wireless controller issue. There's very minimal latency involved in using the Switch Pro controller. I tested latency in a couple ways with the camera pans. I also D-padded through the menu and I swung my sword. And typically to get an in-game response, it took about 40 frames to 44 frames at 180 FPS, which translates to about 220 milliseconds to about 240 milliseconds.
Okay, that's sub-connect. That's worse than connect.
Yeah, so that's really terrible. And then I moved over to the Switch 1 code, but still running on Switch 2 here, but with no major performance enhancements. I can't imagine it's probably fairly similar to the Switch 1 code in terms of input latency. And we're at about 150 to 170 milliseconds of latency, which is also still high, but obviously a lot lower and probably tolerable, I would say. Or at least I managed to tolerate it for, the 20 hours or so that I played the original Switch version. So yeah, that's the biggest issue. I can talk about the other issues, but the input lag is for sure standing out as just a gigantic problem that needs to be addressed immediately.
Right. Okay. Let's talk about the other problems though, because they are legion.
They are. So I'll start off with something positive to say. My guess is that this is basically the full Skyrim Special Edition treatment in terms of the technology. I've not played the other versions in quite a while, so I've also not done comparisons with the other versions except for the Switch 1 version, so I can't comment too much on those. But you get volumetric lighting here, enhanced post-processing, including SSR, depth of field and bloom, redone foliage, pushed out draw distances, better texture assets, the whole shebang here. It looks dramatically transformed relative to the Switch 1 version, which I think you can see here in these comparisons. I did some pixel counts, and it seems to be running at 1440p internally in dock mode, which I think is using DLSS. But there are a few problems with the game that are a little bit odd. Like if you look in this area, which is the Rift, the distant tree LODs are like blue tinged. Maybe they're grabbing a wrong asset for that LOD. But when you approach, the blue goes away, seeming as they transition LODs, right, down to like LOD 1 or LOD 0 or whatever it is. So that's an odd issue. And if you go over to switch 1, that isn't a problem at all. But interestingly, the distant trees there also take on a more monochromatic look, but they're yellow tinged. So I'm wondering what that problem might be. They also might be billboards at a distance. I'm not sure. I didn't look too closely to check, but that shouldn't impact things too much, I wouldn't imagine. And then with the water, when you move the camera around, the water surface moves for a frame or two before falling back down when you tilt the camera, when you move the camera around. So that's pretty weird, I would say. I would say also the file size is also pretty large for this game. It's 53 gigabytes as opposed to 13 gigabytes for the Switch 1 version, roughly speaking. But given the asset improvements, I think that makes sense. I think this is roughly in line with the other versions of the Skyrim Anniversary Edition that are based on that Special Edition code. And as one final note, I'd also just say that this is a 30 FPS title. And I think even despite all the enhancements for a 14-year-old game, it would be really great if 60 FPS was on the table or 40 FPS. And I think a lot of gamers would take a degraded visual presentation, maybe with improved resolution, improved frame rates, improved details maybe in some areas, but with that faster refresh. I think a lot of gamers would appreciate that in a game like this. Because you do still see like the 360 PS3 vintage beneath all the nice post-processing and enhanced lighting. Maybe that would have been a better way to go here and just focus as well on keeping that input lag within a reasonable bounds.
Yeah. The 30 FPS thing was basically the first response to the trailer when it appeared. It's like, why is it 30 frames per second? It's like, let's just remember that the Switch 2 CPU isn't that far.
Yeah.
Horsepower-wise beyond the last generation consoles, which also ran at 30 frames per second. The input lag thing, wow, I'm not quite sure how they're going to address that. I mean, that's really not good. It suggests that the pipeline is actually got issues.
Yeah. Who knows how they're doing present is like, I'm just wondering whether or not they're doing something completely wrong that they shouldn't be doing, and it's actually a very simple fix, or if it's something that has to do with just how it meshes with Switch 2 SDK. We will have to see if it gets any updates over time. Based upon what happened with Oblivion Remastered, though, and the pitiful updates that we saw there to improve the technical performance of that game, I'm not completely assured that that Bethesda products on non-Microsoft platforms get the best loving that they could always get. But looking at this game, I am actually just wondering why it is 30 FPS. Like, really? Like have you walked around Skyrim's open world in a long time? Like, there's like nothing going on. Like, there's like nothing going on there. I'm really surprised this is 30 FPS. And I wonder if it was just not kept to 30 FPS because they didn't want to be bothered to make a 60 FPS profile of the game, which would take, it's more of a challenge. You know, you can't just throw all the LEDs to whatever. You can't just put the res up to whatever. You actually have to spend the time profiling. But it should be, I really think this should be a 60 FPS title. I have no idea why it's not. Look at Metroid Prime. Like, right?
Yeah, look at this completely different game.
Well, I mean, there's, in terms of like what has, yes, there are no radiant AIs, you know, being not very believable in the open world here, but you know, you got large open world areas with high fidelity assets, tons of textures, streaming in high quality light maps, which Skyrim doesn't even have. You know, I don't understand why this is 30.
You could level the same claim at the Xbox One and PS4 versions then, surely.
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, yes. I really could. I'm always a little bit surprised because I remember when Skyrim came out, I did not have a good PC at that time. I played it at 60 FPS. You know, like surely Switch 2 all these years later. I really think it's doable. I just don't know why. Okay, especially they have VRR in the handheld mode. You know, they could have done an unlocked up to 60 if they weren't sure of these things. And handheld would have been amazing unlocked up to 60, but we're not there.
Okay, fair enough. We are going to have a more detailed review on that. I am curious if that review is going to be completely nullified by a patch that appears during production of that video, which happens a lot in our line of work, but it is what it is. Even so, there will be more on Skyrim on Switch 2 in due course. But let's move on. This week, we actually had the final reveal of FSR Redstone, the suite of machine learning technologies that AMD is creating for its new era of gaming. Starts on RDNA 4, obviously is going to move into sort of top gear with RDNA 5 going forwards based on what we know about that technology. What we saw this week was essentially a reveal of the machine learning based frame generation technique that has been added to the suite of Redstone services. And we've only just started to take a look at this. Unfortunately, I was just looking at the when it actually was arrived. If we were going to get that content out on time, we would have had to work on the weekend. And
yeah,
that's just not really the way we do things here anymore. If we can help it.
Yeah, it's a shame. I really wish that we got this earlier, but because especially hats off to Hardware Unboxed here. I'm pretty sure they did work the weekend, and I feel for them as a result of that. But they came out with a video that covers all the bases in a wonderful way, including going an extra step that I think, it requires a hardware investment that is kind of costly.
If it's worth doing, it's worth doing, right?
Yeah. They point a 1,000 FPS camera at the screen. So the big issue with pointing a camera at a screen, and this is not saying their work isn't good, is that getting the human eye even to look like a camera. We still perceive things differently than the camera does, which is especially when you put it back on a screen afterwards. But the reason why they use it is because they can show the fact, like the video is titled very well about how frame times in FSR's frame gen solution are just not consistent across titles. And they show it very well without even having to bring up a frame time graph, which is there's a disconnect in the audience there as soon as you show a frame time graph, when a lot of people just play games with, full frames, full frame tearing and stuff like that. You have an audience that is maybe not perceptive to frame time issues, but if you show it in a slowed down way next to or back to back with the ideal scenario, the more ideal scenario, like they did in their video, you get to see the issue. And for me, this Redstone release is a little bit awkward, and I do wonder why it came out at the time it did, because Hub's video very specifically does point out, and here's some video that I've sent to Oliver of side-by-side FSR 4 frame gen versus FSR 3 frame gen, and you'll look at the shadows here on the ground. You'll see that it is due to the fact that it isn't fully reliant on just motion vector data for generating frames, that it can have like a better sense of 3D elements or 2D elements that lack motion vectors, and the shadows look better in movement. And there's going to probably be other things that you'll see that will look better depending upon your scene, because I would say FSR 3 frame generation was quite low quality, but it was strobing every other frame. So that wasn't, that's not the big issue. Strobing every other frame makes you have a greater tolerance and forgiveness for issues in how a frame is rendered or put together at that point, because the persistence is so low and it's persisting next to what is supposed to be an ideal perfect frame. And that mix makes a really great subjective experience, presuming that the frame pacing is right, because that is the issue in the Hub video. And that here's some footage I sent to Oliver. This is FCAT captured footage, 4K 120 FPS in a game called Industria 2, which will be coming out, I believe, next year. You can upgrade that to FSR 4 MLFG via the driver. And just, turning the camera here in a completely empty room, it's getting around 120 FPS. But there's two really great things to point out, is that I'd say this is like the worst example that you could probably find out there, one of the worst examples, where the average frame time is going to look like a near 120 FPS experience, right. But the actual frame to frame times are very different. One is kicking up maybe into the 4 millisecond region, while the other one's going to the 12 millisecond region. So the average is around 8 milliseconds, but the frame to frame difference makes it almost not look like 120 FPS at all in terms of smoothness. But you also see something that Hub talked about in their video, where basically Tim said like, oh, and look at that, there's a frame tear. And that's very interesting because you usually don't expect frame tearing with VRR. But if you're running it with an unlocked non-VSynced frame rate, frame tearing occurs when you go above the refresh rate of the panel. And that is what you're seeing. You're seeing extreme runt frames the phraseology came around in the multi-GPU days, where it's like a tiny little frame that is barely shown. It's scanned out really briefly, and it's probably maybe 20 pixels tall, and it looks like a really big tear in the image. And that's what you're actually seeing. And it's when we FCAT it, you can see that they're actually like 1 or 2 millisecond frame times at that point, and they're very, very small. That frame time graph there looks really ugly, but then you compare it to, here's MLFG turned off. This game is a little weird. It only allows you to run TSR without frame generation on. So this is actually using Unreal's TSR here, but at 50% internal resolution from 4K. And you'll see that frame timeline, although half the frame rate, is markedly smoother. In fact, it's perfect. It's just pure GPU limited goodness. And it also subjectively on a VRR panel, this looks way better. And I feel like when my content about this comes out, I'm also like Hub here. I do actually want to focus on the frame time stuff because I feel like it is the core issue, and I feel like it is something that could be fixed over time. A little surprised it hasn't been fixed yet completely, but I feel like this is the core issue right now. MLFG, the quality wins are going to be there. We've seen it proven already by NVIDIA and Intel, but getting the frame pacing right is actually probably the biggest issue. And I hope that our content, both Hubs, ours, and anyone else who covers that, user reports, can push AMD to make sure that not just a select grouping of games under ideal conditions always has really great frame pacing, but also under more trying conditions, every game, no matter what, only with like a few exceptions. We also see exceptions occurring with DLSS 4 or 3 frame generation occasionally, where I've like pointed out in a game like Reflex causes this game to stutter. I've said that before. I think Dying Light, the Beast at launch, for example. So like it doesn't need to be perfect 100% of the time, but so far I would say a lot more consistent than Hub looked at a lot of titles here, really. I'm sorry that I'm referencing Hub so much, but they did such a good job.
Yeah, I think when the embargo lifted, I looked at Gamers Nexus and Hardware Unboxed, and because why not? And you got to sort of tip of the hat to Tim there, because the work on Hardware Unboxed was just, I'd say, borderline definitive.
Yeah, it was. It puts into question me even working on something.
Yes, I know. That's the problem, right?
Yeah.
The 1000 FPS camera work, excellent. The fact that he was picking up the stuff that you're showing in terms of your frame time data, which entirely corroborates it. When you see those on your content, when you see those spikes up to close to the 0 millisecond line, it's like ultimate runt frame territory. That will present as a big tear on the screen, because the frame time is so short, it will be moving out of the VRR window, which is why that screen tearing is there. But you're looking at the sort of 120 frames per second average there, but for most people, I suspect it will look like a VSync presentation, because you're mostly ping-ponging between 8 and 16 milliseconds.
True that.
So it doesn't even look like VRR at that point. And then you'll have your mega spikes to 0 milliseconds or close to it. And then you'll go straight down to like 16 milliseconds, which, that's crazy stuff there. Work needs to be done there, clearly. So I do wonder how that got out, to be honest, because the stuff that Tim was showing with the camera work is, here's the thing, like when you're making a YouTube video, the whole limitations imposed by the media that we're using, streaming, means that you need to come up with a technique like this to show how bad it is, because the actual real world experience, you will see it, but you'll see it in a different way. And YouTube doesn't really have the temporal resolution to show high refresh rate experiences in the same way. And obviously the audience vast majority of them are probably working from 60 hertz displays anyway. So you've got to kind of have techniques like that. But it should have been like immediately obvious and visible. So yeah, that's kind of weird. I mean, in terms of you using an overlay technique there, AMD is still saying you shouldn't use overlays with frame generation.
Which I just got to start disagreeing with them there. Like a lot of PC users will run overlays. Windows will run overlays on your game without you knowing it. The game bar, you may have your Radeon overlay open and whatnot, and Steam, you can run an overlay. These are all things that are very common to PC gaming, and I feel like it isn't a great excuse for a robust product to say, don't use your computer the way you usually would to a lot of your users, and instead they should have, if NVIDIA can make a robust enough one that runs with overlays, then that's not the issue though. Tim shows all this stuff without overlays, and my FCAP footage, by the way, is just an FCAP bar. There is no overlay running there. It's all the overlays are completely turned off. It's just an FCAT running. People who don't know that, it's a colored little thing on the left-hand side of the screen that is picked up to measure frame times. And that should be light enough weight because FCAT was developed in 2012 to run on GPUs from that time that did not have hardware pacing or Windows explicit pacing. It was really Wild West at that point. So I feel like those aren't very good excuses.
Right. I think the other thing, of course, is that when we presented some stuff to AMD showing these wacky frame times, this was like during the analytical FSR 3.1 release, they said, don't use an overlay. So we used our console tear detection tools without any overlay at all and got the same result. So I don't think the overlay actually has any impact whatsoever. I think this is maybe just a kind of a conservative thing that they're mentioning, just to make sure it's running in the same way that they tested it. But yeah, it didn't have any impact at all. On a more sort of general level, I'm a bit disappointed with Redstone so far. Obviously, the ray regeneration stuff that we saw kind of hit and miss. Wasn't the kind of holistic solution that NVIDIA is aiming for. I mean, ray reconstruction is still a work in progress, really, isn't it, Alex? But it's significantly a step beyond in certain respects. But, it showed promise. FSR4 upscaling is kind of now being included into the Redstone package. I think that's pretty cool. I don't really think, I think AMD has kind of cracked it there, which I think is great news. The Radiance caching, still work in progress. They showed a demo, right? But we haven't got any releases to look at.
Yeah, no announced date even for that. That was in Darktide, Warhammer 40k Darktide. And that would be interesting to see how they implement it, because Warhammer 40k Darktide uses RTX GI, which is probe-based RTGI solution. And the cache there are the probes spread out through the world that are doing multiple traces per frame, and then that's how you're getting multi-bounce over frames, kind of like amortized together. And I'm very curious to see what theirs is in comparison, and whether or not it has a dramatic fidelity differences, for example, because it's presumably a completely different cache. But we don't know a lot about that technology yet, so we have to wait and see. But one thing that I do like about when NVIDIA does debut new technologies since probably DLSS 2 is that they have a lot of in-game examples already for users to check out, usually around the release date. And here we still really only have ray regen in one title where it's pretty hard to use and pretty hard to appreciate.
A couple of final points before I hand over to Oliver is that, first of all, there's a reason why Redstone exists, and there's a reason why Intel and NVIDIA are pursuing machine learning-based features, and you're not going to like the reason. The reason why is really, really simple. Mark Cerny has basically all out said that the future of GPU technology and advances in graphics isn't going to come from stacking up compute units or shaders. It's going to come from a more holistic use of hardware and software. That does mean technologies like frame generation. It is going to become, much more prevalent. I think we've reached with DLSS super resolution and I think FSR4 a point where those features are now accepted as being a part of the mix. Generally, users like to use those features. And I think we're going to reach the point at some point in the future where frame generation will reach the same quality threshold, where it is going to be, the latency situation will probably be nullified. The hit to latency will probably be nullified at some point. The quality will increase. And that, at that point, if you can't tell the difference between that and an actual natively rendered frame, I'd say kind of, job done almost. But that is basically the way that the future of technology is heading, because those process nodes are getting ever more expensive. And in order to get your quote-unquote performance increases, which currently I describe as a frame rate increase, we will be seeing technologies like this. They'll just get better and better to the point where you probably won't be able to tell the difference versus native. That's my thought on that. My second point, which I'm going to say it's a disappointment, FSR 4 Int 8. I was expecting a kind of one more thing at the end of the presentation to say, hey, look, we know there's a lot of RDNA 3 and a lot of RDNA 2 GPUs out there. We have got a fallback solution for you guys and we will distribute it. That wasn't there. That's disappointing. We know it exists. We know it works. What's the problem? Oliver, what's your thought on all of this?
I mean, the frame pacing issues do seem legitimately very poor. They make me reticent to try this. The Redstone implementation so far seems very limited. Obviously, it's quite a muted launch. I mean, there's very few new technologies in the mix that are actually shipping in games. It seems like the main focus is that frame generation technology. We don't have too much utility for the ray regeneration at the moment in various titles. So that's unfortunate. No RDNA 3 support, no RDNA 2 support. Like you mentioned, Rich, that's not good for an incredible volume of RDNA 2 and RDNA 3 parts, some of which are still being sold today, as we've touched on many times. One detail you guys didn't touch on, though, is that they're renaming FSR 4 to just FSR. I don't know if that's such good thing. Yeah, they're renaming FSR 4 to FSR, just flat out FSR. I don't know if Alex is going to like that, but it does seem to
I don't even know how I talk
lot.
about it in videos at that point. I just have to say something else than the official name because it's confusing.
Just AMD FSR. That's their new nomenclature for, I guess, FSR going forward, and you'll just drop in whatever version, override whatever version. That'll be how it has to go.
Okay, sure. Okay.
I mean, at least NVIDIA is pretty clear about like DLSS 4, here's a suite of technologies, here's a version number, here's something you can really attach yourself to. With AMD, it's going to be, I don't even know how they're going to denote version numbers from this point onwards. It's just FSR.
Right. I don't think they actually need to deploy the full FSR Redstone feature set to those older GPUs. I think it's perfectly fine to actually have some level of delineation, but it would put them at a disadvantage against NVIDIA, who've done a pretty good job, I think, of delineating across the generations what you get and still providing some love to like 20 and 30 series owners. I think that's pretty good.
Right.
Yeah, but, the fact that we know that FSR 4 Int 8 exists, and then, no word on whether those older GPUs are going to get a new lease of life by giving it to them when we know it exists. It's kind of a bit rough, I thought. Yeah. I guess, though, as is the case, we could just have to wait and see how all of this evolves over time. I honestly think that the way things are going at the moment, this is probably going to become much more important to AMD when RDNA 5 comes around, which does seem to be a more holistic approach to just graphics rendering in general, which does align more closely with what NVIDIA have been doing. Yeah, so I guess they've got a sort of certain period of time in order to get this right. But, the fact that these frame pacing issues didn't get noticed, that's not a good early indicator, right? Right then, so let's move on to supporter Q&A, which is the part of the show where every week I petition our supporters on Patreon for their input into the show, comments on our topics, questions, choose the best or other ones we're best equipped to answer. A couple of questions here we grouped into one. First of all, Wild Westy. Should have been Wiki Wild Westy. Hi, gents. It feels like we're heading towards a gaming tech performance plateau. Skyrocketing RAM prices, 50 series refresh cancellation rumors, a void from NVIDIA on feature releases after the previous progress with DLSS ray reconstruction, etc. And of course, a new Steam machine with just 8 gigs of RAM. Linking that to last week's Witcher chat, if CDPR are aiming at a 6-year trilogy timeline and building up the foundations up front with engine and assets to be reused, And if Witcher 4 releases at the end of this console generation, doesn't that mean Witcher 6 will be current gen shaped even halfway into the next gen? Despite the gloomy sounding speculation, is this a rare moment for budget gamers to rejoice? Maybe sitting on AM4 based rigs with optimized settings could see us well up to the PS7 era. Wow. This one from Alexander Zianov. Hello, exclamation pointers. Do you think PS6 will start an era of double cross-gen with games being simultaneously released for PS4, PS5, and PS6? Cheers! Exclamation point. Interesting question here, Alex. It is basically, I mean, I did an article about it the other day on the digitalfoundry.net website, which is, potentially there is a kind of, maybe calling it a dark age is an exaggeration, but certainly we're looking at more games having to be made playable across more devices than ever before.
Yeah. I think an aspect of this that isn't completely mentioned is the fact that maybe the next generation consoles will be delayed as well as a part of this. Not just that there's going to be a certain stagnation of PC hardware releases, but that will also affect the console manufacturers, which might be possibly a thing that will happen, because when you look at the price of RAM and you try and imagine if someone as big as NVIDIA is not allocating to gaming or AMD is not allocating to gaming like they previously could, why would Microsoft and Sony have that allocation? Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they wouldn't. So that's another part of this. So maybe the going into PS6 next gen is actually, we're talking about more years in the future than this person, both Wild Westy and Alexander here, may be thinking of. But in general, I think this is going to be the shape of things anyways, regardless of the RAM crisis, just due to the market size and the cost of getting into the hobby anyway. It hasn't gone markedly down for a while now, and to keep there's only going to be X million amount of PS6 users, about 1 to 2 years into its lifespan, even 3 to 4 years into its lifespan, and you're going to need to recoup costs for your super $500 million US dollar budget game. You're going to need to release to previous generation owners with the PS5 and Xbox Series X, and I think that I expected that for a long time anyway, and I think that's what everyone should expect, excluding a couple of releases, and what they will be, I cannot tell you because they haven't been announced yet, probably. Or maybe it's that Star Wars game that we just saw earlier today, right, Oliver? Other than that, I don't think we're going to see many PS4 releases by the time PS6 comes out. I really hope not. The only one I can think that would even venture it would be Call of Duty, to be honest with you. I think Call of Duty could do it, but everyone else I think will be long past PS4.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I am wondering at what point the Call of Duty franchise will give up on PS4 support, because it seems to be like almost baked into the engine that there is that level of scalability there. I think from my perspective, going to Alexander's point here, I don't think PS4 will persist. I think it is, it's sunsetting. I think it is the end of the road for there. But I think, when you look at PS5 onwards, you've got a reasonable CPU. You've got excellent storage, which I don't think has been still fully utilized. You've got a decent GPU. Graphics are scalable. So, yes, I can see that becoming like an entry level. I think the RAM situation on Series S could prove problematic, along with the fact that Series in general just seems to be sort of, well, let's face facts, there does seem to be a sense that it's winding down. But, PS5, I think, will serve as a baseline, maybe Steam Machine as well. Oliver, thoughts?
Yeah, well, I can report, perhaps to our excitement and merriment, that next generation's Call of Duty title has been reported as not being on last generation consoles.
Wow.
So after 5 years, they're finally getting around to it, which is pretty remarkable, that latency there. In terms of The Witcher 4, I think whatever content decisions they make for The Witcher 4 are probably likely to influence Witchers 5 and 6, especially if those are really 3-year projects as described, because they're going to make all kinds of choices and assets in like how fast do you traverse the environment, how does streaming look like, how are things chunked, things like this that are probably going to be anchored to current generation specs. So I suspect it's going to be a lot easier to scale that stuff up than it is going to be to redo it, especially if they like reuse the same open world between games or substantial parts of the open world between games. That would be an element where it's like really, I mean, how are you not anchored to the last gen specs if it's the same world? I mean, in a real sense, you are anchored to that. But I wouldn't count out the idea that, I mean, I strongly suspect Witcher 4 will be cross-gen. I think Witcher 5 may be cross-gen as well. Who knows? Maybe even Witcher 6. It's really hard to say at this point. So those could be anchored to the last generation systems in more ways than one there. In terms of PS4, PS5, and PS6 cross-generation games, it is tantalizing to imagine PS4, PS5, PS6 three-way head-to-head. But I think it'll only really apply to like very popular live service games. Like I could see Fortnite continuing to maintain, a PS4, PS5, PS6 version. I could also see like, Final Fantasy 14 or something continuing to support the PS4 code at the same time as shipping like a native PS6 app. I could expect that, probably not for very long, but I could see that happening because there is still a substantial base of players who are just cost constrained and just play like free-to-play games on those older systems.
Going back to AM4, I mean, point is that if you put an X3D processor into one of those systems, then basically you're basically producing like up to double the CPU performance of a PS5. So yes, that will persist for quite some time until such point as, there does seem to be a bit more of a moving target in terms of PC performance than there is on consoles. But, I still think that will probably persist for quite some time. In fact, I'd love to basically go back to, because I've got an original Ryzen 1000 system somewhere in storage. I'd love to just put an X3D processor in there and a new GPU to see what happens. Right. And how good it actually is. Because there are certain limitations with those older systems. I guess principally lack of PCIe 4.0 support on those earlier boards. But, I think AM4, probably one of the biggest success stories in the PC gaming space for quite some time, and the longevity of it and the genius of X3D. I think X3D for that platform has been like, in terms of like, sustainability, in terms of like longevity, it's just been borderline miraculous. Yeah. And it's just been brilliant as well for it to actually become a staple part of the lineup, just pushing performance on to that sort of next level. So I think AM4 will probably be all right for next gen. I mean, obviously, it probably won't be up there with Zen 6, but running at 30, who knows? Who knows at this point? Fascinating story, fascinating question as well. But yes, I do think it is fundamentally going to be, as we've said in the past, one of the longest cross-gen periods we've ever seen, certainly compared to the current one. Let's move on. A question here from Jonathan Thomason. Do you think the rising memory costs is going to lead to vendors making a bigger push for unified memory architecture on desktop PC, where we will start to see products for more enthusiast users as well? Interesting question there, Alex. I think on the one hand, the rising memory costs affects products with unified memory architecture. But on the flip side, I'm thinking of like Strix Halo, which also uses unified memory. Yeah. I'm also thinking of like Steam Machine, which has more memory in aggregate than the PS5, but may have texture quality issues that the PS5 won't have. So yeah, it's a bit of a nuanced question.
Yeah, nuanced in the aspect of we have UMA on PC in the aspect of there are devices that ship with a unified pool of memory on hardware, but the way Windows addresses it is not so. And the games aren't going to be addressing it that way. That's why on those boards or devices that do have a unified pool of memory, technically, you tend to allocate manually in some BIOS setting or somewhere else, like how much is dedicated to graphics and how much is not. Yeah. And because games on PC are not coded against that, and I'm pretty sure actually DirectX on PC is not going to be taking that into account. Direct storage, for example, still has the intermediate stage of sitting in system memory and then going out to your GPU's memory over the PCIe bus. It doesn't just go directly there. That would be amazing for us, but that is not the case. Here in this case, I would say it will not do that right away. It would take a long time for we've seen how long it takes for a DirectX to change. I don't think this will be the way out of it, even though it technically would mean having to use less memory for the same thing. So, because what typically ends up happening is all those textures that you have in memory, your GPU memory, that is, like let's just say you've got 4 gigabytes of textures on an 8 gigabyte GPU. They all are also mirrored up in system memory at that point, and maybe even in a larger or a smaller form, depending upon compression and everything like that, and how much is being buffered ahead for frames in the future and areas you may be going around the corner in soon and things like that. There could actually be a larger amount of stuff in that memory there. So you're using all this extra memory for stuff that is just about making sure that it gets across the PCIe bus faster. And if you did have a way that it was addressed like on consoles, then you would have less memory used overall. And then maybe you need to buy a PC with, less memory overall and potentially less cost to the consumer. But, I don't know. I don't see a desktop push for this happening anytime soon because there isn't a motherboard, pre-existent motherboard that exists that addresses this concern beyond stuff like, I don't know, like taking laptop parts and throwing them into a desktop chassis. So I don't think it's very realistic at this point in time.
I've got a couple of points. The Ryzen APUs, you can give them like X amount of gigabytes for frame buffer memory, and it can dynamically allocate more if it needs it. But at the same time, that isn't really a guarantee for developers who might require that system memory for the game, for example. It can only dynamically allocate so far, I guess. Secondly, the other point I'd like to make is they still haven't cracked the notion of an upgradable system with unified memory architecture, apart from having more DRAM. Mm-hmm. But the point is the GPU doesn't have access to that. And if it does have access to that, it's got to access it via PCI Express, which is suboptimal. Let's move on. Question here from Andrew Barker. Hello, DF overlords. I'm not sure what were the overlords of exactly. DF, I suppose. With all the talk of a PS3 emulator for PS5, do you think Xbox might consider porting its back-compat software over to PS5 to release specific Xbox/Xbox 360 games over to Sony's console for release on PSN? Well, this was a question that caught my imagination because back in the day there was an agreement between Microsoft and Sony that Microsoft would host Sony's cloud infrastructure. That agreement didn't actually seem to go anywhere as far as I'm aware. But, I was thinking back in the day, well, the Series X architecture in Azure, I'm pretty sure that the back-compat geniuses are Microsoft could have created an emulation layer for PS5 to run PS5 games on Series X. But this question being asked here by Andrew Barker is actually quite a lot more simplistic because there were stories that there's going to be a Windows emulator for those Xbox and Xbox 360 games. And if they've got that, I'm pretty sure they could easily port that across to PlayStation 5 and just package games around it if they really wanted to. I don't know, realistically, that seems plausible. Well, what do you think about that, Alex?
Well, I think while plausible from a technical standpoint, there's just one thing that, the only hiccup is that DirectX box was called DirectX box because of DirectX. They would have to switch over to a different graphics library. That's the only really big difference. But as soon as you get over that hump, they would be doing the exact same thing they'd be doing that they do on Xbox One and Series consoles that they detailed with us long ago about basically repackaging the game. It's like EXE to be x86 compatible, which is pretty cool. And I think they just wouldn't do it mainly because, they have certain limits probably on how far they're willing to go in, deleting themselves from the market. And I think,
right, okay,
that is maybe the last nail in like the coffin at that point. Like it's even better to play your old Xbox back compat games on a PS5 Pro kind of thing. Like that'd be just like the ultimate embarrassment.
I get what you're saying.
Maybe they just wouldn't do it for that case. But also, I don't know. We haven't heard about the back compat program in a while. And it's like how its context in the future of Xbox. They've mentioned it with that, like the AMD video that they put out. Like, oh yeah, we're talking about back compatibility and we're going to secure it in hardware. But that's still a very big question mark. I don't know if I trust Microsoft to make actually this backwards compatibility thing on PC so well anymore. I don't know. They've ruined my confidence in them. So I don't think they would even do it on PS5 as a result.
I think there's 3 points there, basically, which is, first of all, the embarrassment factor, which you've just described. Secondly, I'm thinking more about effort versus reward, because you're quite right. You should point out the DirectX situation. So essentially, Microsoft would need to engineer its own version of what would effectively be like a Proton compatibility layer to map DirectX instructions to the equivalents on PlayStation hardware. That is not a trivial task, and yeah, that's kind of it, really. It's certainly tricky, and the concept of actually getting any kind of financial reward for such a mammoth engineering undertaking is not particularly compelling. Anything to add, Oliver?
Just to say that it really depends on what the future of the Xbox is. Is Microsoft basically operating with the idea that they're operating their own platforms from here on out, even if they're PC-oriented, PC-based platforms, with the PS6 as an adjunct and the PS5 as an adjunct and the Switch 2 and Switch as an adjunct? Or are they trying to spread their own platforms onto competing devices and have, indeed, everything be an Xbox, right? That's kind of the question. And I think the appeal of those older games is a bit more limited relative to a newer title like a Forza Horizon 5 or Horizon 6 or the new Halo, for instance, Campaign Evolved. I think those titles are going to bring in the big bucks for Microsoft and not, let's say, Conquer Alive and Reloaded or something. Like, I'm interested in that. I'm interested in Grab by the Ghoulies. I'm interested in Fusion Frenzy. I'm interested in all those older games. But is the average PS6 user interested in those games? I think if they were, they could probably splurge for a Series S and be perfectly happy, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, right. Let's move on. This question from Matt. I hope that with the announcement of quote-unquote major improvements to Windows, yes, we're going there, Alex, we might see some actual improvements rather than regression, but I remain largely skeptical based on Microsoft's previous claims and their almost complete apathy to DirectX over the last 5 years. What I would really like to see is the ability to install Windows without any of the OneDrive or Copilot crud. I know I can disable/remove it, which I do, but it does seem to reinstall itself every few updates. Would it also benefit most users to have a level of back compatibility in Windows removed or at least limited to allow for a more streamlined modern underpinning to the OS, with some of that moved to an emulator or a VM? So specifically, Mac is talking here about a range of improvements that have been mooted by Microsoft for Windows. It's in a blog post talking about stuff like power and scheduling improvements, graphics stack optimizations, background workload management, and perhaps most promisingly of all of that stuff, advanced shader delivery for more hardware, not just the Xbox Ally handhelds. So yeah, Alex, what do you think about this? I mean, I don't really think that. Yes, you can uninstall stuff like OneDrive and Copilot, etc., but I don't think it actually has any impact on system performance as such. But it does present. I mean, if Microsoft came out tomorrow and said, actually, we've got a stripped-backed Windows 11 for you, which is solely for gaming, I think that would probably be quite welcome by a lot of people.
Yeah, me included. So I want to take this step by step because this is a very long question. The major improvements to Windows. I, like you, have felt the Microsoft apathy. I also would like the install process to be much more, you go to Windows 98 and you look at the install process, and there's like you can click to add the multimedia stuff. You can click to add the extra stuff. You can get rid of online features with all these like little click boxes. It can be actually customized to your liking. In Windows 11, you have to basically log on with a Microsoft account unless you do a command line interrupt and restart the computer during the logging process to fake that you don't have an internet connection. And then it'll allow you to actually install the classic Windows way, where you have just an offline user that is not tied to some MS account, which is the way I prefer to use Windows, because I actually don't like logging on my PC. And if someone wants to break into my house and log on my PC, you know what? Power to them. Those are things that I agree with you about, very much so. I don't think, like Rich said, I'm not sure a lot of them actually have a huge system draining resource for the everyday. I would love to see some benchmarks of them, but I think a lot of them aren't even active all the time. And I don't think they're going to become active when you're in the middle of a game, unless you have a scheduled OneCloud upload during a certain time or something like that. I don't think Copilot should be running while you're running a game, but who knows if they will add in some sort of gaming Copilot thing that
there is a gaming Copilot
that runs over your game and just really annoys you. I haven't turned that on yet. It has yet to get in any game that I've seen. If it does, then I'm going to probably complain about it. But at the moment, I don't know. I would need to see the benchmarks to allow that to thing. Once again, the backwards compatibility stuff in Windows, I don't think it is a huge drain on CPU resources or something like that. I think it is a drain, though, on some strange functionality that you come across, like when you go into the control panel and you see doubled up options in multiple places in Windows, or when you see an option that is only available in one area, even though you imagine in your head it should be available in another area of Windows. And I also think it slightly comes about occasionally if you right click in a game, and it's usually an older game, and you have to look at like borderless windowed compatibility. There's like full screen optimizations option, as well as, like forcing compatibility for weird hookups that existed in the Windows Vista to Windows XP era. That's why you can force things to like be compatible with Windows XP Service Pack 3. Those are things where I think it affects older games, but I don't think it is a big issue with, current games. Current games are written for like the latest version of DirectX, and they're not bothering themselves with those things anyway. It's mainly an older game thing. So I don't think getting rid of backwards compatibility is the way to make Windows leaner. I think Windows needs to be leaner by allowing users to dedicate more resources and more of the core and more of everything to just the gaming experience if they so choose it, and not have the OS be designed around other aspects of questionable productivity, even if they don't want it. That's the thing. It's like forcing you into a certain lane and not allowing you to have the Windows be the way it, you'd want it to be. So that's my big deal. This blog post, so that they're referencing, there has been a presentation by Intel saying that they want to use the new shader standard and to essentially, through their driver update, allow you to download those SODB blobs, I think they're called, and kind of have your games have pre-compiled Intel shaders on your Intel device if you so would like it. And I think they do mention here, and working with other partners, I think they're referencing both AMD, specifically Intel, and we have yet to see anything from NVIDIA on this in a present capacity. So I think that's what it is. I hope they do that well. I still have my big question marks whether or not they'll do it correctly, and we see a larger change in the industry. There's a couple other things that I would love to see them change, in there too. I would like to see maybe more transparent direct storage usage, allow the user to change whether or not a game explicitly uses CPU or GPU decompression, because devs have made the wrong choice quite often to the detriment of certain hardware. There's a lot of things that I think that they could do within Windows. And most recently, the DirectSR push has been an absolute no-go. No one cares about it. And developers are having to roll their own integrations of XeSS, DLSS, and FSR. And really, at this point in time, there should have been and should be a forward-looking interface for developers to use where the driver just says, oh, we're going to use FSR or we're going to use DLSS or we're going to use XeSS because you're using an Intel chip. And I feel like at some point in time that should become a driver thing, just kind of like anisotropic filtering became a driver thing. So those are things that I think Microsoft should have been on years ago. And I'm not sure how they actually get it up to a standard where this actually becomes something that helps users in modern games, because it's going to take like 5 years for it to actually become implemented at this point. So a lot of stuff there, a bit of a wishy-washy answer, but I just want to say, I agree fully with you. I wish there could be a more streamlined version of Windows that is more focused towards gaming.
I agree, but I think the other thing is just like, I think there's two things. I'd call it quality of life and quality of performance. I'm still thinking about my ROG Ally, which mysteriously lost a whole bunch of GPU performance the other month. But, what happened there? I don't know. There's got to be some sort of internal way for if Windows is kind of doing all of this weird stuff, there's got to be some kind of self-check mechanism to make sure the system is running as it should be running. Right? That you don't have this problem on a console. But something happening with Windows can cause problems like that. And more to the point, the Xbox interface, the full screen experience, as it's called, it's got a lot of work to do on that. I think it's still not a particularly compelling interface based on what I've seen thus far. I mean, it's a step in the right direction for sure, but it's not great. Secondly, stuff like the onboarding experience shouldn't be just plain Windows if you're looking to produce a gaming-centric operating system. Windows Update and driver updates need to be combined into one thing that happens. Firmware, similarly, the same with firmware updates and BIOS updates, that sort of thing. All of this needs to be sort of homogenized into a single thing that happens at boot, just as it does on an Xbox console, and crucially, as what happens on a Steam Deck and presumably a Steam machine. So those are the things that I kind of would like to see. And, to be fair, advanced shader delivery actually looks, potentially very, very strong. We still need to test that on the Ally. It's a bit difficult to put it through its paces with handheld architectures where there's so many different bottlenecks. But yes, I mean, it's certainly a step in the right direction. Oliver?
Yeah, I think one big problem, I mean, obviously you guys are the Windows experts here. I'm not going to go through all the changes you guys described in all that detail that you'd like to see. But I think one problem here with just this general premise is that all these services they're describing, OneDrive, Copilot, you also have your automatic Teams install, your Game Pass, your Windows 365. These are all how Microsoft makes money. Right. Microsoft makes money off selling the license to OEMs, but they're also making money on the services. They're making a ton of money in the services. So without the services involved, that's not a great deal for them. Now, the kind of compromise way you can maybe excise some of these services and not have some of the automatic updates pushed on you is to get a long-term service or long-term support version of Windows. I know Microsoft offers LTSC versions of Windows. They call it, that's their dubbing of the long-term service option. And those, I think, are updated very sporadically and only with very stable OSs. That would be my suggestion. I don't know that you can get that easily outside of large organizations, but that's one potential way to get around this. The other thing is for Copilot, I do wonder how many resources Copilot is using on the person's computer potentially, because Copilot, for the most part, it's not local. It's based on the GPT series of LLMs published by OpenAI. And they were mostly run in the cloud, like your GPT 5.1 or 5.2, which was just released. Those are running in the cloud, and effectively the output is being streamed to your device. So there are some functions that Copilot will do locally, like live captions on a so-called Copilot Plus branded PC, or Windows Recall would potentially be something that you might be concerned about if you have Windows Recall turned on. But as far as I can see, all of the functions that are under the Copilot Plus program and currently run on an NPU are functions that seem to be fairly discrete that you would toggle on and not things you'd have likely to run in the background, unless you're talking about Windows Recall, which I don't think most people have enabled anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, good stuff. Let's move on. Final question. This one comes from Ian. Good morning, Foundryman. Does Oliver consider Outlaws on Switch 2 to be a more quote-unquote bespoke port than AC Shadows? In Outlaws, it seems like they try to preserve the graphical feature set through specific and tailored work to, say, cut down geometry, whereas Shadows to me feels much more like playing a game on a PC handheld where you just crank the settings and resolution right down. Well, this is interesting, right? Because obviously we had 2 cutting-edge games coming to the Switch 2, and I guess they could be considered sort of impossible ports for Switch 2 to the extent that we don't really know fully what's possible and impossible at this point. But there were certainly 2 different approaches here with those ports, right, Oliver?
Yeah, I wouldn't quite characterize it as one is more bespoke than the other necessarily. I think there are a lot of asset changes in Shadows as well, and it's not necessarily inelegant. They also have a virtualized geometry system, which might take away some of those obvious laud decreases in quality to you. And there are a lot of changes to key systems, which I hope to describe in more detail in the future. But I think it is true that like Outlaws inherently just is a more scalable game than AC Shadows, because you see that in that more of the core visual makeup translates to Switch 2 and Series S, but it's also like a different kind of game. It's not doing nearly as many interesting simulative things as Shadows. Its open world isn't as rich. Its scope is smaller. The planets, I think there are 5 of them. They're a lot smaller in scope. They're a lot smaller in size. They have more quarter-like segments. They have more closed-off areas. Obviously, the game doesn't use strand hair, which is of a considerable performance cost in AC Shadows. But this whole conversation is broader than just Switch 2. It's like AC Shadows has this sliding scale of visual features that I noted in my piece that get stripped back as you go down to the lower end platforms. But that's true whether you're going down to like PS5 performance mode or Switch 2 or Series S. Everything's getting cut down gradually. Even PS5 Pro performance mode, you're losing the strand hair, you're losing the specular reflections, the RT specular. All that stuff is changing on a per platform basis. Whereas with Outlaws, I'm not going to say everything is preserved, but like the core of it, which is like those 3 ray tracing effects, RT, GI, distant RT shadows, RT reflections, that's all preserved. The general scope, scale, the world, the way that grass moves, the foliage assets, everything like that is being preserved. So I think that game just inherently scales a lot better. And it's really hard to compare the 2 ports and say like, this is better or this is worse. Like I think that like ultimately Outlaws might look more impressive, and obviously the fact that it's using so many ray tracing effects on Switch 2 is highly impressive and interesting, but it's also just a different game than Shadows, and I think both are extremely impressive in their own ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, especially when you're running in handheld and it's drawing less than 10 watts.
Yeah,
kind of remarkable, really. Anything to add to that, Alex?
I think Oliver got it basically. You're just looking at 2 different types of open world games. I would say on the CPU side, in terms of simulation occurring, one is less scalable than the other. I'd say you have to have a lot more NPCs in Assassin's Creed to make the world more lived in looking than you might have to have in like these hobbled up towns and the cities in Star Wars Outlaws. You walk into them, they are a lot smaller and more compact and less. You can see where the scaling is going on to make that game work within the budget it had when you go to those things. But whereas you go to Assassin's Creed City, like Kyoto or whatever, it's like, it's ridiculous. You just can't you can't call all those people. It just doesn't look like a city anymore. So, I think here that's what we're seeing more. Is this a game that is less scalable in general versus the other one? And I am impressed though still that they did manage to have ray tracing there in Outlaws where it's not there in Assassin's Creed. I wonder what that would have looked like if they had actually attempted it as like a separate mode you could turn on, kind of like they did on the other consoles. I wonder what that could have looked like if they did make it.
Yeah, in their technical notes, they were saying it was more of a memory thing than performance thing, which I thought was quite interesting.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking forward to seeing where we go next with these ports, right? Because I think Outlaws was a bit of a game changer in terms of expectations, right? And the fact that you could actually have ray tracing in a sub 10 watt machine.
Yeah,
it's pretty remarkable at the end of the day. And I look forward to seeing more. I do wish I'd love to see an Avatar port just to see how they would do it. That would be quite phenomenal.
It would be interesting.
It would be interesting for sure. Okay, well, that was the last question, therefore the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed it, ring bells for notifications for you, and algorithmic boosts for us that might just be entirely in my own mind. Who knows? The DF supporter program, patreon.com/Digital Foundry. Join our supporter program, early access to content, including the direct news updates from the team. Lots of lovely stuff going on there, but that's all from us for this one. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry, and maybe we'll see you next week.